How could a man who once grew up in such hunger that he survived day to day on peanut butter sandwiches end his life at the very peak of fame, yet with a heart more shattered than it ever was in poverty? That man was Kenny Rogers, someone who sold over 100 million albums, won Grammy Awards, dominated every major chart, and became an immortal icon of country music, yet also someone whose final days would leave anyone who hears about them with a heavy heart. This was not a glorious retirement, but an escape from malicious rumors, a solitary battle with illness at a time when a global pandemic had locked down the entire planet. You will discover a side never before told, a star so haunted by the specter of his father's alcoholism that he never dared touch a single drop of alcohol, only to allow music itself to devour the happiness of 4 separate families. So what were all the tragedies behind Kenny Rogers? And why did a man who once had everything depart in such cruel, unforgiving silence? Everything began with hunger itself, and the dark corners of poverty in Houston, where a legend was forged from early life humiliation rather than from any glow of glory. At that time, 4th Ward was a scar on the city, where Kenny grew up as the 4th child in a family of 8. They lived in a public housing project for impoverished white families, a hastily built complex erected on land once occupied by displaced people of color. To the outside world, that housing project was a form of relief, but to young Kenny, it was a cage of cracked wood and baked brick. It was so cramped that even the air seemed rationed. The darkness of poverty was not confined to peeling walls. It sat right on the dinner table. Years later, even after owning vast estates, Kenny Rogers could never forget the severe lack of nutrition. In his memory, dinner was often nothing more than cheap peanut butter sandwiches carefully divided. "I don't think I was ever truly starved, but we were definitely malnourished," he once recalled with a sad smile. Peanut butter was the only luxury that kept them alive from day to day when his father Edward's wallet was completely empty. Hunger did not scream. It smoldered, leaving the Rogers children pale and gaunt, imprinting a terrifying obsession with an empty stomach. That deprivation forged a ruthless drive to escape. Kenny did not grow up with fanciful dreams of art. He grew up with a more brutal, practical goal: to survive. At 14, while other children his age were beginning to experience their first stirrings of romance, Kenny was kneeling on the floor of a hat shop, rag in hand, earning $9 a week. That $9 was not for candy or comic books. It went straight into the thin palm of his mother Lucille in exchange for another loaf of bread. As he grew older, the desire to escape 4th Ward burned ever hotter. He found work as a waiter at the Rice Hotel, one of the most luxurious establishments in Houston at the time. There, the contrast between 2 worlds struck him hard. Kenny carried trays piled high with fragrant steaks and wine to elegant gentlemen, only to trudge home alone after his shift to the housing project, his stomach churning with hunger. He worked himself to exhaustion, not to become rich or famous, but so that he would never be hungry again. Music, at that time, was only a faint glimmer, appearing when he won first prize in a talent contest at the Texan Theater in 1949, a sign that his voice might be the ladder out of the abyss. The year 1956 became a milestone of early glory, radiant yet soaked in tears. Amid the poverty and lack of education that had blanketed generations of the Rogers family, Kenny achieved the unthinkable, graduating from Jefferson Davis High School. Wearing a borrowed graduation gown, Kenny stood on the honors platform as the first person in his family to hold a high school diploma. It was a victory over fate. In the stands below, Lucille sobbed uncontrollably. Those tears were not only of pride, but of knowing that her son had officially placed 1 foot outside the housing project. Yet the brilliance of later success never fully erased the darkness of the past. The poor child from Houston always lived on inside the multi-million-dollar artist. Many years later, at the very top of the world, Kenny learned that an old neighbor in Houston had fallen into desperate hardship. Unable to repair an old car needed for work, because she lacked $600. Kenny did not hesitate. He sent a check for $20,000 along with a handwritten note. "Thank you for helping my family pay the rent back then." To the public, that act was extraordinary generosity from a star. But to Kenny himself, it was redemption. The $20,000 was not for the neighbor, it was for Kenny Rogers to soothe his own soul. He was trying to repay the past, trying to use money to fill the voids left by the humiliation of once begging for rent. He wanted that money to say to the skinny boy scrubbing the floor of a hat shop years before, "It's okay now. We'll never have to go back to Fourth Ward again." After tentative early steps with the jazz group the Bobby Doyle Three and a brief stint with the folk group the New Christie Minstrels, Kenny finally found his destiny when he formed the first edition in 1967. This was when his stardom burned brightest. With long hair, dark sunglasses, and a beard that would become his trademark, Kenny Rogers was no longer the waiter from the Rice Hotel. In 1968, the breakthrough masterpiece Just Dropped In was released, sending shockwaves through the music world. The song's haunting psychedelic rock sound propelled Kenny into the ranks of the most influential stars of the era. He became a symbol of musical fusion, where the boundaries between pop, rock, and country were blurred by his signature raspy voice, warm yet commanding. Subsequent songs such as Ruby, Don't Take Your Love to Town cemented Kenny's status as a master storyteller. On television screens, millions of viewers saw a confident man in complete command of the stage, seemingly holding everything in his hands. But behind those vividly colored frames lay a dull gray reality of family fracture. While Kenny was busy building his musical empire, back home his father Edward was sinking deeper into the bottom of liquor bottles. Edward Rogers had once been a skilled carpenter, a man with deft hands whose heart had been crushed by the harsh realities of post-World War II America. Prolonged unemployment and the humiliation of being unable to support 8 children drove him down the path of addiction. It was from that darkness that Kenny made a ruthless vow. He would never touch a drop of alcohol. Throughout his life, even while living in the temptation-filled world of entertainers, Kenny Rogers maintained an extreme sobriety. Yet that sobriety did not bring father and son closer. Instead, it erected an invisible wall, cold and rigid. Kenny feared alcohol because he feared becoming a copy of his father. He kept himself clean, but that very purity inadvertently became a silent sentence passed on Edward. Whenever Kenny looked at his father with sober eyes, Edward felt judged. And whenever Edward was drunk, Kenny retreated further into the world of career and numbers. As the years passed, the greater Kenny's fame grew, the deeper the chasm between him and his father became. There is one detail that Kenny later recounted in his autobiography with unending regret. "I never once asked why my father drank." He admitted that he had been too busy succeeding, too busy running from poverty, to remember to understand the man who had created him. Kenny saw his father as an alcoholic, rather than a man wounded by his times. The silence between the two Rogers men was not born of hatred, but of not knowing how to find each other between two extremes, one side radiant with success, the other mired in crushing failure. The most tragic collision of these two worlds occurred at one of Kenny's concerts at Sam Houston State University. As Kenny stood under the spotlight, receiving thunderous applause and preparing to bow to the audience, an unimaginable scene unfolded. His father, Edward, not in a sober state, staggered straight onto the stage. Before thousands of stunned spectators, the aging carpenter stood beside his superstar son and began to bow as well. It was a moment both absurd and heart-wrenching beyond measure. In his drunken state, perhaps Edward wanted to share the spotlight just once, to be acknowledged by the world as part of this success. Kenny had to lean close to his father's ear and whisper, "Dad, this is my show." That bow from Edward became a symbol of a father's helplessness left behind by life, desperately clutching at the coattails of a son who had flown too high. For Kenny, It was an emotional losing hand. He could command tens of thousands with his voice, yet he was utterly powerless to rescue his father from the abyss of addiction. Until Edward's death, that silence was never broken. Kenny carried the secret of his father's pain with him into his final days at Beaver Dam Farms. He realized that neither the brilliance of Just Dropped In nor the multi-million-dollar hits that followed could illuminate the dark corner of his relationship with his father. Success had taken him out of Fourth Ward, but it had also carried him too far from the embrace of the father he should have held and asked one simple question: why were you hurting so much? Kenny Rogers became an icon, but the price of that sobriety and glory was a permanent void in his heart, one that no song could ever fill. By the early 1990s, the name Kenny Rogers was no longer merely that of a singer. It had become a cultural institution in America. After the first edition disbanded, Kenny entered his solo era with the mindset of a man pushing all his chips into a single fateful hand, and he won. He won so spectacularly that the glare of his fame was enough to blind anyone standing beside him. But fate always finds a way to collect its debts at an exorbitant price, sometimes paid with the very lives of those he loved most. In 1977, the song Lucille echoed across every radio station, earning Kenny his first Grammy Award and flinging wide open the gates to the Temple of Legends. But that was only the opening shot. In 1978, The Gambler was released not merely a hit song, but a philosophy of life that would remain inseparable from Kenny's image until his very last breath. He embodied the drifter on the midnight train so perfectly that people forgot where Kenny Rogers ended and where the character in the song began. What followed was Lady the Ballad, written by Lionel Richie, which elevated Kenny to the status of a global pop star. The numbers began to dance, more than 60 top 40 hits, albums like The Gambler and Kenny becoming household staples across America. The peak came in 1986 when a poll conducted by USA Today and People magazine crowned him the most popular singer of all time. At that moment, Kenny Rogers was the living embodiment of the American dream. From a poor boy in public housing to the most powerful man in the music industry, holding both fame and fortune in his hands. Yet while the world knelt before the new king, behind the curtain, Kenny was facing a tragedy he would later call a scar that never healed. Amid the glow of gold and platinum records, there was one woman who always stood beside Kenny, not only as a musical partner, but as a kindred spirit, Dottie West. Together, they created timeless duets like Every Time Two Fools Collide. Dottie was more than a collaborator. She was one of the few who truly understood Kenny's pain and his roots in poverty, because she herself had come from hardship. In the early 1990s, Dottie West's life fell into tragedy as she faced a bitter divorce and declared bankruptcy. Seeing his closest friend collapse, Kenny Rogers, generous like an older brother, stepped in to help. He not only supported her emotionally, but also gave her a practical gift, a car, so she could get around, continue pursuing her career, and rebuild her life. Kenny wanted that car to be wings that would help Dottie fly again, but fate turned it into a steel coffin. On the 31st of August 1991, Dottie West was driving that very car to a performance at the Grand Ole Opry when it broke down along the way. Rushing and afraid of being late, she called a neighbor to give her a ride. Shortly after, a catastrophic accident occurred on a freeway ramp in Nashville, leaving Dottie critically injured. After several days fighting for her life through agonizing surgeries, Dottie West passed away forever. Dottie West's death was a brutal slap to Kenny's life at its very peak. The symmetry was cruel beyond measure. Kenny had used his fame and money to save his friend, yet that very gift, born of kindness, indirectly led her to her death. Had he not given her the car, perhaps she would not have been on that stretch of road at that moment. The most painful truth Kenny carried for the rest of his life was a smoldering sense of guilt. He tormented himself with the realization that his wealth could buy everything except safety for those he loved. The glow of his Grammy Award seemed to dim whenever he thought of Dottie. In later interviews, whenever her name came up, Kenny's voice would falter. He felt he owed her a far brighter life than the one she was given. This obsession did not stop at tears. Kenny transformed his pain into a decades-long journey of atonement. He used all his influence, voice, and power in the music industry to fight for one single goal: to induct Dottie West into the Country Music Hall of Fame. He believed it was the final justice she deserved, and also a way for him to ease the torment of that fateful gift years earlier. It took 27 years after her death, until 2018, the same year Kenny's health began to seriously deteriorate, for that wish to come true. When Dottie West's name was officially announced in the Hall of Fame, Kenny was too weak to celebrate loudly, but he posted a brief message: "Congratulations to my friend, the great woman Dottie West." It was more than a congratulation. It was the sigh of relief of a man who had finally repaid a debt of the soul before he himself stepped into the darkness. As the 1990s arrived, Kenny Rogers had nothing left to prove in music. He had it all. But with the instincts of someone who had grown up with hunger, he never allowed himself to stop. In 1991, together with a former CEO of KFC, Kenny founded the restaurant chain Kenny Rogers Roasters. It was not merely a matter of lending his name. He infused it with his own DNA, rustic, warm, and approachable. In a remarkably short time, the rotisserie chicken empire exploded to hundreds of locations worldwide, stretching from North America all the way to Southeast Asia. Kenny's kind, familiar face appeared on every street corner and every menu, turning him into a symbol of multifaceted success. He was no longer just a singer for hire. He was an owner, a tycoon standing at the pinnacle of financial power. Yet it was precisely the trap of constant busyness and the hunger for expansion that blinded him to the cracks forming within his own home. While the world saw Kenny as a national husband through tender love songs like Lady and Through the Years, the reality at home was a very different story. In 1993, his 16-year marriage to Marianne Gordon, the woman who had stood by him through the early rebuilding of his solo career, officially collapsed. This was not an ordinary separation. It became a media explosion marked by a then record-breaking settlement of $60 million. The failure with Marianne marked the fourth time Kenny walked away empty-handed from marriage, turning him into a lonely giant amid his own vast fortune. That $60 million was more than money. It was a sentence for Kenny's years of absence. It was the price he paid for tours that stretched on for months, for business meetings that ran through the night. The painful irony lay here. He sang of eternal love to millions, yet could not hold on to the love of the one woman who had always waited for him behind the door. Kenny's most painful revelation was not about the money he had lost, but about a bitter admission to himself. "I was too ambitious and selfish. I chose my career over them." It was the confession of a man who realized he had won every business deal, yet had failed miserably in the role of a father. That pain crystallized most clearly in the distance from his first children, Carol Lynn and Kenny Jr. During the brightest years of the 1970s and 1980s, when his children needed a father to teach them how to kick a ball or hold their hands on the way to school, Kenny was busy conquering the Billboard charts or expanding his restaurant chain. The distance of time became a distance of the soul. Even later in life, when he tried in every way to make up for it, the wound of missed moments was something that never truly healed. Whenever he looked at the twins, Justin and Jordan children, who came into his life at its final chapter with Wanda Miller, Kenny felt a double burden of guilt. He loved them fiercely, devoting every remaining moment to them as a form of belated atonement. Yet that very devotion became a mirror, reminding him of the brutal absence he had inflicted on Carol Lynn and Kenny Jr. Years earlier, he realized that he could build a rotisserie chicken empire spanning the globe, but he could never buy back a single lost Saturday afternoon with his first children. And as the darkness of old age began to close in, he was forced to face the final hand, one in which money and restaurant chains meant nothing before the cruelty of time and the last legal battles. In 2017, the farewell tour The Gambler's Last Deal was launched as the final goodbye of the king of country music. On the radiant stages of Nashville, kindred spirits like Dolly Parton and Lionel Richie stood to honor a living monument. Audiences saw Kenny Rogers still smiling, still singing with all his heart, but few knew the extraordinary effort behind that smile. He stood on stage with unsteady legs, his body ravaged by degenerative joint disease, every step a tearing pain. At this point, glory was no longer exhilaration, but a burden of pride he wanted to leave as a victor, not as someone defeated by old age. Yet, even as a living legend at 80, the world did not spare him. Another harsh shadow emerged, a legal battle with Capitol Records. Kenny was forced to sue to reclaim $400,000 in unpaid digital royalties. There was a bitterness almost unbearable in the sight of a man who had generated billions for the music industry, now at the twilight of his life, still struggling against corporate sharks to protect every hard-earned dollar. It exposed a brutal truth. In the world of fame, once you are no longer profitable, you are nothing more than a number on a balance sheet. Leaving behind the exhausting legal battles, Kenny chose to retreat to his Beaver Dam Farms estate in Georgia. But this was no peaceful retirement. Instead, within the suffocating silence of the vast property, the once legendary The Gambler began to endure the days he would later describe as a complete shattering of the heart. The physical pain from degenerative joint disease and the complications of old age relentlessly ravaged his body. But perhaps the emotional pain was far more cruel. Out on the distant lawn, his twin sons, Justin and Jordan, the children of his fifth marriage to Wanda Miller, were playing. Watching their strong, energetic strides and hearing the crisp laughter of two boys who had just turned 15, Kenny felt his heart tighten. There was a cruel irony in it all. Kenny had spent more than 60 years conquering the world, earning hundreds of millions of dollars, ensuring that his children would never have to endure the extreme poverty he had known in his youth. Yet now, when he possessed everything money could buy, he realized he lacked the one thing money was utterly powerless to provide: presence. Kenny once shared, in a labored breath, a confession that would later bring listeners to tears. My heart breaks when I hear people talk about taking their kids to college, because I know I won't be there. That was not the voice of a star. It was the cry of a dying old father. He looked at his children and began calculating in his mind. When they turned 20, he would be 86. When they married, he might be nothing more than a photograph on an altar. Every centimeter his sons grew taller was another step bringing him closer to death's door. That helplessness seeped into his soul like a slow-acting poison, turning the final days of his life not into the indulgence of a millionaire, but into a long chain of regret. In 2018, when his health completely collapsed, Kenny was forced to make the most painful decision of his career, announcing the cancellation of the remainder of his farewell tour. For an artist who regarded the stage as his very breath, being forced to stop was like having the life drained from him. On sleepless nights, tormented by pain, Kenny often sought comfort from a very special friend, a small goat named Smitty. Many would laugh at the idea that a global music legend could find peace beside a goat. But to Kenny, Smitty was the center that kept him balanced. In his loneliest moments, when the darkness of exhaustion closed in, Kenny would sit quietly beside Smitty on the farm. The goat didn't know he was a superstar, didn't care how many Grammy Awards he had won. It simply stayed there, accepting him in all his frailty and old age. Smitty represented a simple, grounded piece of real life that Kenny had missed during decades spent chasing the spotlight. The goat's presence allowed him to momentarily forget the echo of 100 million albums sold and focus instead on his own breathing in the present moment. Yet, even that peace was tinged with tragedy. Every time he looked at Smitty, Kenny was reminded why he was there. He no longer had the strength to sing, no longer had the strength to walk, and most importantly, he was learning how to stop, just as his own classic song had once taught. The gambler once sang, "You've got to know when to hold 'em, know when to fold 'em." In his final days at Beaver Dam Farms, Kenny Rogers realized that he was having to fold. He was letting go of the spotlight, letting go of unfinished dreams, and preparing to let go of the two sons he loved more than his own life. The room at the Georgia estate grew darker with each passing day. Kenny was preparing for his final hand, in a world slowly closing down because of the pandemic, and in a heart breaking from the knowledge that his great journey was about to end in silence, far from the milestones of his children's lives that he had always longed to witness. The 20th of March 2020, while the entire planet trembled and held its breath under the onslaught of a global pandemic, while once bustling streets lay eerily empty under lockdown orders, in his home in Sandy Springs, Georgia, Kenny Rogers was embarking on his final journey. Look closely at this merciless irony. A man who had spent more than half a century connecting millions of hearts, who once stood in blazing stadiums with tens of thousands of fans chanting his name in unison, now released. His final breath in the frightening silence of end-of-life care, accompanied only by the slow ticking of time and the heavy scent of disinfectant that defined an era of disease. His passing was unlike that of any musical legend before him. Ordinarily, when an A-list star dies, red carpets are covered in roses, and thousands of fans gather to light candles and sing love songs together. But for Kenny, the pandemic stripped away the right to be bid farewell by the world in its most glorious form. There were no towering wreaths sent by fans, no thunderous eulogies read aloud before a crowd. Everything was confined to an isolated space, where only his devoted wife, Wanda Miller, and his children remained at his side. The man who had spent his entire life using his voice to break down barriers and warm lonely souls was forced to leave the world at the very moment humanity itself was separated by walls, masks, and the fear of human contact. Fate seemed to have staged an unbearably cruel play for Kenny Rogers. He departed as the world was closing, his personal solitude merging into the solitude of all mankind. The image of Kenny Rogers lying there, his breath slowly fading, evokes a heartbreaking metaphor for the song that defined his legacy, The Gambler. For 60 years, he had won thousands of hands on the road to fame, knowing when to hold the glory and when to fold the pressure in order to rise higher. But on that fateful night in March, the final hand was laid bare. His opponent was not another gambler on a train bound for nowhere, but the total exhaustion of a body worn down after a lifetime of relentless touring. The final cards fell onto the table. Kenny no longer had to battle joint pain, no longer had to worry about whether Capitol Records was paying his royalties in full, and most painfully, he no longer had to torment himself over whether he would live long enough to see his children go to college. He passed away from natural causes, a phrase that sounds gentle, yet conceals the complete collapse of a monument, drained of all strength by time and old scars. His family later released a heart-rending statement. Because of the pandemic emergency, only a small private service would be held. One of the brightest stars in American music faded away in a quiet funeral, without fanfare or ceremony, amid a world in panic. That silence was like the final rest in a long, tragic symphony, leaving behind an emptiness that could never be filled in the hearts of those who remained. The final hand of Kenny Rogers' life ended in a way even he might never have imagined. He had won every game with fame, turned his name into an immortal symbol, yet lost everything in the hand played against time and the people he loved most. The glow of 100 million albums sold had faded, The applause of tens of thousands had receded into the past, leaving behind one stark truth, that the peak of fame can sometimes be the loneliest place on earth. If you feel moved by this deeply tragic journey, please support us with a like and subscribe. Your support is the motivation that allows us to continue digging deep and telling real-life stories that are inspiring yet soaked in tears like this one. Are you ready to cherish the hand you've been dealt? Goodbye, and see you again.